Following the Battle of Pharsalus, Caesar sent Marcus Antonius to Rome with news of his victory, and with instructions to maintain control of the city while Caesar pursued Pompeius Magnus, who had fled east. As the remnants of senators and wealthy families began making their way back to Rome, Caesar, taking only about 4,000 of his soldiers with him, followed after Pompeius, that he might procure his surrender, and put an end to the civil war once and for all. According to the historian Livy, Caesar arrived in Alexandria only 2 days after the betrayal and murder of Pompeius Magnus on the beach near Canopus. Entering the royal palace, he was officially presented with the severed head of Pompeius Magnus by Ptolemy's rhetorician, Theodotus of Chios. Caesar recoiled in horror, and when Theodotus gave Caesar Pompeius's signet ring, Caesar genuinely wept, according to some historians, as Caesar's wish had been to pardon Pompeius. Other historians, however, claim these were crocodile tears. Caesar vigorously upbraided the court of Ptolemy XIII, demanding they turn over to him the murderers of Pompeius Magnus. He also commanded him to recover the Roman general's body and cremate it with appropriate honors. In order to notify the Senate of the death of Pompeius Magnus, Caesar sent his signet ring to Rome, where Marcus Antonius, in charge of overseeing the city's political situation, had secured for Caesar a second term as dictator, in effect for a period of 1 year. Now dictator, Caesar next summoned Egypt's king and queen to a meeting, ordering them to disband their armies. The 13-year-old king, Ptolemy, was with his army near the Egyptian fortress of Pelusium, where his forces were busy blocking the oncoming mercenary army his elder sister, Cleopatra, had managed to raise in Syria. Journeying to Alexandria, Ptolemy responded to Caesar's summons, but ignored Caesar's command to disband his legions. Cleopatra, unable to attend the meeting personally, sent negotiators to Caesar to explain her position as queen, driven from her realm, and blocked from re-entry at the border by the army belonging to her brother husband's advisors. With Ptolemy's legions still near Pelusium, Caesar ordered his 4,000 troops to move from the harbor into the city. Because he desperately needed funds with which to pay the vast legions he had gathered during the wars, Caesar demanded the Egyptian throne repay the monies borrowed by the late king, Ptolemy Auletes, for acknowledgement by the Roman Senate, which totaled more than half of Egypt's yearly revenue. Despite protestations by Pothinus and Theodotus that Egypt's coffers did not hold so much coin, Caesar announced he would remain in Egypt until the funds had been collected, during which time he would adjudicate the dispute between king and queen. Outraged by Caesar's obvious extortion of the Egyptian throne, and by the presence of Roman soldiers patrolling the streets of Alexandria, Pothinus and Ptolemy planted spies to foment unrest within the city. Riots broke out in various parts of Alexandria, but Ptolemy pled ignorance. As Ptolemy continued to claim innocence, the rioting continued to swell. When several of Caesar's soldiers were killed in the street violence, Caesar ordered his forces into the royal quarter, taking immediate custody of King Ptolemy, his advisors, and his siblings, the 17-year-old princess, Arsinoe, and the 11-year-old prince, Ptolemy XIV. In Pelusium, hearing of Caesar's reputation and thinking to make use of his weakness for affairs, Cleopatra decided to journey to Alexandria to meet him in person. The historian Cassius Dio tells us that Cleopatra traveled to Alexandria behind her brother's back, where she easily won Caesar over with her wit, charm, intelligence, and attractive clothing. But it is Plutarch who gives us Cleopatra's famous coup d'état whereby, dressing in rags and taking only a Sicilian slave named Apollodorus, the beggar queen journeyed 8 days along the Nile River, bribed Alexandria's harbor captain to lift the defensive chains and allow her tiny skiff to reach the palace docks, then hid inside a laundry bag, wherein she was carried directly into the presence of Caesar, who was both amused and delighted at her clever entrance. Whether the truth lies with Dio or Plutarch, or somewhere in between, the point on which historians agree is that, whatever the details of their rendezvous, Cleopatra spent the entire night with Caesar. By morning, King Ptolemy, Pothinus, Theodotus, and Princess Arsinoe knew Cleopatra had returned to the palace, and was consorting with Caesar. Although it is fashionable to imagine the young Cleopatra, in a single night, seducing the most powerful man in the world into submission to her political schemes, it should be noted that Cleopatra was an intelligent woman, who spoke 8 or 9 languages, including Hebrew, Aramaic, Parthian, Ethiopian, Median, and was also the first of the Ptolemaic line to even bother learning Coptic, the language of Egypt's citizens. Neither did Caesar have a reputation for allowing his heart to rule his head. As a youth, Cleopatra had spent time in Rome beside her exiled father, and had gained a valuable understanding of what motivated Romans, what passed for honor, and what outraged them. Though she and her husband, in a joint venture, had sent forces to Pompeius Magnus in Macedonia, her obligation to support Pompeius on behalf of her father expired when her brother's minions murdered the general. Cleopatra could approach Caesar with a clean conscience, knowing that she had maintained loyalty to the man who secured her father's throne, even if she was not loyal to his cause. It seems likely that Caesar, who was handing out pardons to Pompeians like Saturnalia greeting cards, would have responded favorably to such loyalty. Despite Ptolemy's attempt to enrage the citizens of Alexandria even further by broadcasting his sister's illicit affair with Caesar, with its subsequent betrayal of Egyptian interests, Caesar called an assembly of the 500 most prominent citizens of Alexandria, who handled the day-to-day affairs of the city. At the Assembly of Alexandria, Caesar read aloud the will of the late king, Ptolemy XIII, which had been among the possessions of Pompeius Magnus. The will named Ptolemy and Cleopatra as joint heirs, with Rome as executor. And Caesar, as dictator, embodied Rome, and thus decreed that Ptolemy and Cleopatra would resume their joint rule of Egypt. Hoping to appease the Alexandrians, who still held a grudge against Rome for the loss of Cyprus during the tribunate of Publius Clodius 10 years earlier, Caesar also arranged for the youngest son, Ptolemy XIV, and Princess Arsinoe, to rule together on the island of Cyprus. This would also remove them as potential claimants to Egypt's throne and eliminate the threat that factions would form in support of them. Pothinus and Ptolemy, however, were not happy with Caesar's decision. While Ptolemy still maintained his throne, and his position as king, obviously it would be Cleopatra, by virtue of sharing the dictator's bed, who would rule in Egypt. In response, Pothinus sent word to Achilles, who was still with his legions in Pelusium, to march for Alexandria. Once in the city, Achilles besieged the royal quarter. Caesar, with only 4,000 soldiers, could not face an Egyptian army of 20,000 soldiers, which included the Roman Gabiniani. He sent emissaries to explain to Achilles that, as the highest representative in Roman government, he was simply executing the wishes of the last king per the written instructions of Ptolemy XIII, who had given the responsibility for administration of his last will and testament to Rome. As soon as the emissaries arrived, however, Achilles put him to death, letting Caesar know there would be no negotiations. Within the confines of the royal quarter, Caesar and Queen Cleopatra maintained custody of King Ptolemy XIII, Princess Arsinoe, Prince Ptolemy XIV, Pothinus, and Theodotus, but were surrounded by the forces of Achilles. Caesar's saving grace was that the streets of Alexandria, which were so narrow that every attempt by Achilles' men to breach Caesar's perimeter was repelled. Caesar, who sustained control of the royal harbor, dispatched messages to his allies for military reinforcements, but such aid would take time to arrive. Achilles turned his attention to Alexandria's great harbor, where both the Egyptian fleet and Caesar's ships were moored. Although Caesar could freely receive incoming messages through the royal harbor, Achilles could stop Caesar's incoming supplies by taking control of the great harbor. Caesar, who was a brilliant tactician, also understood the importance of the great harbor to his survival. Ordering a diversionary attack against the royal quarter, Achilles sent troops to the great harbor, but Caesar, anticipating this strategy, had enough forethought to station men at the harbor's entrance. The fight over the great harbor was bloody and brutal, and cost Caesar the lives of many of his men. Caesar's small force could not hold against Achilles' superior numbers. Their best defense of the harbor was to delay Achilles long enough for some of Caesar's men to set the Egyptian fleet on fire. The ships burned quickly, and before long, fire spread into the streets, where a portion of the Great Library of Alexandria, along with some manuscripts stored in the area, were seriously damaged. Having successfully torched the Egyptian fleet, Caesar directed a small detachment to sail across the harbor, to the island of Pharos, and set up a perimeter. This island, home to one of the seven wonders of the ancient world, the lighthouse of Alexandria, also stood guard over the entrance into the harbor. Having secured control of the harbor, Caesar's forces returned to the royal quarter. Now forced to rebuild the Egyptian fleet, Achilles continued his attacks against the royal quarter, in the face of Caesar's continual fortification. Employing slaves, Pothinus notified Achilles of the location of vulnerable points within the royal quarter, and of his plan to assassinate Caesar. But, when Caesar's men caught these slaves passing messages outside the walls and subjected him to torture, they readily gave up Pothinus to execution at the hands of Caesar. The princess Arsinoe, however, made a daring escape from the royal quarter. Protected by her eunuch, Ganymedes, the princess successfully reached Achilles, where his troops immediately proclaimed her Arsinoe IV, Queen of Egypt. Although in Princess Arsinoe's escape Caesar had lost one royal bargaining chip, he continued to expand his fortifications. Using battering rams to tear down the walls of citizens' houses, Caesar worked to break out of the confinement of his besieged position, even as Achilles used citizens' homes to build more walls to keep Caesar confined. After several months of building fortifications, yet still in a military stalemate, Queen Arsinoe attempted to break the deadlock, executing Achilles, and installing her eunuch, Ganymedes, as commander of the Egyptian military, with orders to flood the canals beneath the royal quarter with seawater. Now deprived of his fresh water sources, Caesar became frustrated. Hearing the grumbling of his own men who had suddenly become armchair generals, criticizing and questioning what he did or didn't do, Caesar surrendered himself to the wine jug, spending his nights drinking himself into a stupor.